Excuse me, little burp because I just drank some water. Funny how you burp when you drink water. Excuse me, wow. Anyway, this is Storyteller Mitch with some more Nightwalker. Have you ever dreamed that you were flying? Who knows what strange places you visit in your sleep? Sometimes you dream of falling. Often we define danger in our dreams. ... Shafts of mocking golden sunlight poured into the laboratory from the jagged and shattering glass of skylight, which Howard Trent had installed 2 winters ago. The warming beams of sunlight watched over the burned-charred wreckage of the explosion. Several master beams supporting the roof structure had collapsed inward, creating a crazy tangle of crossing obstacles in the center of the lab. These in turn had crushed the various electrical machines housed in the steel cabinets lining the floor. Twisted, tangled wiring like a maze of spilled spaghetti dangled haphazardly about the ragged edges of the enormous hole gutted from the floor. A gaping enormous wound of a hole into which had streamed a torrent of debris when Howard Trent's laboratory had exploded mysteriously in the night. The door sagged dangerously. Wooden boards and steel braces lay exposed like so many ribs on the human body. A week had passed. 7 days in which the reality of the accident had still not yet penetrated the dull trance-like aura that claimed Irene Trent's mind and soul. Her widow's weed became her. Black went well with the silvery blondes who owned fine faces and equally fine figures, especially if they had the bearing and deportment of a great lady's. The great ladies never weep. And great ladies never weep. Irene started into the monstrous hole in the laboratory floor. Its dark sides fascinated her. It was as if she could find the street of the explosion somewhere down there among the charred remnants and massed debris. She was still wearing black that was unrivaled by the show of white or other offending bright color. Only the silver of her blonde hair offset the stark blackness of her dress. Mrs. Trent? She turned slowly, seeing the middle-aged man for the first time. She had come upon her quietly. He was wearing a well-used fedora, a soiled trench coat and black gloves as if he were mourning. Howard Trent, too. His face was blank and somehow expressionless. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, Mrs. Trent." She drew herself away from the hypnotism of the enormous hole. "Who are you?" He produced a wallet from his coat pocket, brown and well-used, too. "Frank Malone, Arson Squad. I work with the Inspector Rice. You talked to him on Wednesday?" At the investigation? Of course, he didn't really remember the inspector. There had been so many faces, so many questions, so many unspoken suspicions. Malone was glancing around the room with seeming casualness. She knew she wouldn't remember him again either. Everything surrounding Howard Trent had a way of dissolving into the mass of forgetfulness now. "Why are you here?" she asked dully. "They told you at the inquest that the case was closed." We somehow managed to look apologetic. "Just making a final checkup. This the first time you've been here since the accident?" "Yes, I was away when it happened, spending the night at a hotel." He nodded. "I know." He implied that he knew everything. "Have they found out any more about the cause?" Malone moved away from the hole toward the wall beside the open doorway. There was a shelf extending along the length of the wall, holding an assortment of metal equipment, portable control board, circuit breakers, and rheostat, all charred, broken, and twisted out of shape. Malone ran a gloved hand across the debris. Just that there was an explosion, everything's melted. He can't trace any circuit." He grunted feelingly. "The heat must have been tremendous. Look at that." He held up a twisted, fused piece of metal. "Unfortunately, the fireproof door and walls saved the rest of the house. They never found my husband." Malone didn't answer that one. In thermonuclear experiments, the intensities and temperatures involved are so great that it would vaporize anything located close to the source of the explosion. Why didn't she evaporate? Holy shit. What the fuck were they doing in that lab? Irene Trent shuddered, a sudden picture of poor blind Howard melting into nothingness. Malone took her by the arm. Sorry, if you don't mind. He was moving her toward the doorway. What are you doing? Malone motioned her outside and pointed to the heavy metal padlock dangling from the steel door. Padlock. He reached down and snapped the clasp into the groove. It clicked decisively. This area is unsafe. Off limits now. You understand? I have no desire to ever go in there again, Irene Trent said. Malone was going away, heading downstairs. She went after him, a sudden doubt assailing her. The middle-aged detective was moving slowly down the steps. Irene, hurrying to reach him, caught sight of the army of Trent clocks mounted on the walls of the hallway. Of course, they were silent now, too. Every blessed one of them was anchored quietly at 12:15. 12:15, the precise hour and minute when the laboratory had blown up. Mr. Malone? Irene called. He glanced at his own watch, then, pausing halfway down the stairs. Yes? Reminds me, if you don't mind, I'd like to phone and report to my office before I take off. I'm sorry, we never had a telephone here. He grunted again. I'll call from outside. Mr. Malone? Yes, Mrs. Trent? She composed herself. It's safe for me to live here? His nondescript face broke in a slow smile. He flung a glance sideways at the house, his black gloves spread apart. Yes, perfectly safe, Mrs. Trent, as long as you stay out of that room. She watched him leave, knowing the fact that as soon as he was gone, it would be as if he had never spoken to him at all. She had only wanted to be reassured, to reaffirm the ugly doubts and gnawing fears in her mind about the house and Howard Trent. The night seemed darker than ever. Irene curled fitfully in her bed, tried to sleep. She was poised indecisively in that twilight world of betwixt and between. Sleep had come, but at great cost to her peace of mind. The Trent house was a labyrinth of ghosts and unpleasant memories. There were the clocks, of course, tick, tick, tick. The gigantic muffled chorus of their voices sounded beyond the bedroom door, but there was an unreal echo chamber quality to the rhythm of their ticking. Tick, tick, tick. She stirred in her sleep, fighting restlessly against her soft pillow. Even the filmy nightdress, holding her slender figure in plucking fingers, felt warm, like a shroud. A shaft of moonlight spilled across her fine face, showing the troubled lines of her beauty. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Irene Trent opened her eyes. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. There was no mistaking the new sound in the still night, a slow, ominous cadence approaching the very door of the bedroom. She was wide awake now, sitting upright in the bed, her heart starting to pound unreasonably. It couldn't be, yet it had to be. She had heard the tapping rhythms of Howard Trent's cane too many times to be in any doubt now. It was Howard. He was somehow alive, mysteriously, alarmingly alive, and he had come back. Swiftly, not afraid now, Irene reached for her robe, slipping it about her slender body. Her hands felt nerveless. She sprang across the room to the door, heedless of the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. The cane echoed hollowly through the house. Irene grasped the door handle, hesitated, then took in a deep breath which made her lungs ache. She pulled the door back wide. The tapping stopped. Her eyes strained into the half-darkness of the gloomy hallway. Only the tickling of the clocks, the low, timed tick-tick-ticks crept up the staircase, wending subtly down the hallway, and then tap, 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 tap. She heard the cane again, far off, moving away, a fading sound, yet this time there was the accompanying terrifying sound of footsteps. Irene held her breath. Her heart thumped wildly. The cane and the footsteps were receding back to the stillness of the night. Howard, she murmured, too shocked now to think clearly. He raised her voice, summoning all her determination. She had left. Her eyes reached the hallway. "Howard!" There was no answering voice, only the sudden startling clang of the something metallic, the steel door which led into the laboratory. Hold on, my kid's knocking on the door to come in. Give me a second. No. Okay, I'm back. Just had to let my child in. Alright. "Howard!" There was no answering voice, only the sudden startling clang of something metallic, the steel door which led into the laboratory, she gasped, new apprehension stirring her mind. That and a terrible new fear. Why had Howard come back like a thief in the night to his own home? She ran down the hall, her bedroom slippers slapping the carpeted floor. Her house robe fluttered, her silvery hair bobbed. She caught herself, a racked sob and whimper forming in her dry throat. The walls of the house were closing in on her, trying to shut her out, trying to force her back to her room. "Howard!" she cried again. It had all the wild unreality of a nightmare. She halted in amazement. A low yet violent boom of explosion came from the direction of the laboratory, the identical sound of that other night, the other time when Hora had come to visit the Trent house. The foot of the stairs, her head jerked upward, her eyes widened in disbelief. Smoke was whirling out beneath the steel edge of the laboratory door, beginning to bellow with alarming speed, smoke black and ugly. Impulsively, Irene rushed up the stairs towards the smoke, through all her common sense and instinct told her to turn and run. Her body hurtled toward the inevitable. Through a cloud of thick fumes, she saw the shining metal padlock hanging open, the closing hasp exposed. She didn't want to go through that door, but she had to. How long could she go on living without knowing the truth, as awful as it might be? "Howard! Howard!" she shouted, plunging into the smoking blackness of the laboratory. Swirling clouds rushed at her. She shielded her smarting eyes with her hands. Behind her there was still the master symphony of the ticking clock, sounding her ghostly serenade. Tap, tap, tap. Again it had come, the sound of the cane. This time, nearer. Irene cried out in terror, stopping short. The smoke flurried and wheeled like a tornado, and Howard Trent's face loomed with shocking suddenness before her, hanging in the mist of smoke like some Halloween head in the dark window of a cold October evening. Howard was dressed as she had last seen him, the smoking jacket. His hands were now encased in black gloves, one of them curled about the white cane. But he had changed. Oh, how he had changed. The entire left side of his face was a horror mask. Burned, scarred tissue, fleshly puckered from the forehead to chin. And for the first time, he was moving like a blind man, groping toward her through the smoke and the blackness. His face was set in a ghastly grin. The terrible damage of the left side of his face shone wetly in the gloom. Irene backed away, cringing, her hands held up to protect her face. "No, no!" she screamed. Howard closed in on her, his awful face enlarging rapidly as he came closer. The dead casts of his sightless eyes were alive with something sinister, something beyond reason. Irene Trent screamed with all the strength she had in her. The smoke and clouds of the narrow confines of the laboratory took the sound, magnified it, and sent it bounding down the halls with gobbling echoes. And Howard Trent drew closer, closer, closer. Irene Trent came awake with a startled gasp. She opened her eyes, full, remain, still to halt the mad beating of her heart, and listened. The house was silent, only the soft whisper of the clocks and the faraway sound of the world outside. She shook herself. The filmy night dress clung calmly to her body, clammily to her body. She tried to think, to reason, but she couldn't. There was only one way to be sure. Purposefully, without even trying to piece together one more coherent thought, she slipped into the robe that had been folded neatly in a chair by her bed and moved out the room once more. Down the dim hallway, past the haunting sound of clocks, up that terrible staircase, to the steel door, which closed off the wrecked laboratory from the rest of the world and herself. She stood before it, trembling, hardly daring to look, but she raised her eyes and made herself look. A long sigh, something akin to peace, escaped her. The padlock was back on the door. Closed, sealed, and intact. Relief flooded her with an almost unbearable sense of exultation. Her heart ached. It had been, after all, only a nightmare. Irene Trent's eyes suddenly frosted over. Enough was enough. It was high time for a sensible, practical woman to do something that was sensible and practical. She went back to her bedroom thoughtfully. That was the only way to combat terror. And that's it for now. Okay, thanks for listening.